Hey, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Hoppe. Today's episode is about intimacy. You know, if I was walking down the street and I asked a random guy, hey, what do you think makes for great sex, the best sex? 9 times out of 10, most guys might start prattling off a list of physical attributes. You know, they want that big dick, that fat ass, or those juicy lips. But ask a different question. Instead, ask, tell me a story about the time that you had the best sex of your life. And I bet, although those superficial qualities matter, of course, not gonna lie, a big dick or whatever can be fun. But what often rises to the surface instead is that magical, transcendental experience of bonding that makes sex special. That's intimacy. That's what's driving us often to open up Grindr or to head down to Steamworks if you're in Chicago or log on to Sniffies. But toxic masculinity has wormed its way into our little brains and convinced us that sex is just about getting off. But today's guest reminds us it is so much deeper than that. Shane Lukas has made something of a career out of intimacy. First, as a professional sex worker, he developed an intimate understanding of what drives us, especially as men, to seek out sexual connection. And, spoiler alert, it's not just about the nut. Today, through his graphic design firm, A Great Idea, Shane continues to find ways to promote intimacy and connection through his quote-unquote empathy-led design services. Let's listen in.
Shane Lukas, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast.
Thank you, Trevor. Glad to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you. I have been an admirer for many years, and I'm so glad we got the chance to connect finally through my husband. And I am very curious for people out there. Tell us a little bit about, before we get into kind of the work you do now and how you got to where you are, where did you grow up? Situate us in young Shane's life. Where is this taking place?
I grew up in the Midwest in the rural part of Central Illinois. And so spent most of my life out in the fields and just kind of exploring the great vast nothing that is cornfields and soy fields.
Well, that sounds like an interesting place to be queer.
There were not a lot of out queer folks back then, right? So I just turned 50 this year. So this is way back. This is the way back machine. So There weren't a lot of people who were out, but there were some really courageous people who were. And I think that was great to see early on growing.
What do you think, as a young queer person growing up in that context, when did you start to feel maybe you were a little different from the other guys?
I'll be honest, I actually it didn't really cross my mind that was my story or my identity until I was dating a person who's a cisgender female, and now non-binary identified. But they and I had this conversation and debate about what it meant to look at your significant other in this sort of checklist. What are the things that matter? And the things that mattered to me the most weren't the body parts. They were really all these other components of themselves. And that really kind of broke open after a long discussion about what my affection, what my pleasure centers, what all these things could come from. And I think that is what opened the door. And I will say, I was also a theater kid. And so the accused of being gay and a lot of the sort of fey or femme kind of things that ended up coming out of performance and that kind of stuff is common. But I didn't really take that to heart as that was my story. I wasn't necessarily stuck with the stigma of it. I just wasn't sure it was my story. I think for me, I came to it intellectually more than I think by experience. By the time I was 17, and I came out at 17, once her argument made sense, I was like, makes sense to me.
Yeah, convinced. Yeah. When you came out, did you come out, as a gay man, bisexual? What?
It's a great question. Because back then the languages were so limiting.
Yeah.
And I think I would say bi, and I would say even to this day, where I came to the term queer, it very much felt at home. My first publishing experience was poetry in a bisexual publication, or my first national experience. And so to me, I always came to embrace queer and the possibilities of queer early on, even before I could really articulate that language.
It's fascinating because queer went through a kind of renaissance in the 90s as this like terminology that people used. Are we talking about that time? Is that when you would have used that term?
Yeah. Because it actually, queer was already being used even in the 1960s and early 1970s. It was used as a rebellious phrase, right? Like there was, I'm here and I'm queer. There were uses amongst a lot of advocates and activists already of the term. And when I came out, a good example of what happened at the same time is that David Wojnarowicz's work made its first national exhibition in my hometown.
Wow.
At one of the state universities. And so while I didn't identify at the same time within that story, it was sort of like it lived in the subtext of this environment where there were so many universities and there were so many people who were already engaging at that time in the AIDS epidemic, which was very much in motion. And I think I came to understand queerness, if you will, just kind of unconsciously. So by the time I came to understand it academically and intellectually, I was on board. But I think the conversation to bisexuality at the time was the sort of natural way. It wasn't that I was afraid to be gay. It was that like, oh, I can understand my sexual self in a way that isn't limited by this confine. And while I'm a masculinist, like why generally I'm attracted more to men, more to people who are sort of masculine of center. I generally understand also that I'm also attracted to people sort of in a broader gender identity spectrum.
And those early, like your first forays into sexual experiences, what were they like?
I started with Planned Parenthood as an activist when I was 14, years before I had sex.
Wow.
And so the first time I had sex was on my birthday with my girlfriend at the time, who was not the same girl who the same person who introduced me to sort of bisexuality. But it was like very strange experience for me, and at the same time I loved it. Obviously, before that, there had been some interaction, I think, with different, I would say, sexually charged experiences. So they weren't necessarily engaging in intimacy, but there were definitely moments of sort of friction with like my babysitter's daughters and stuff like that. There were definitely pieces of that. I don't know that I ever felt at home in it. I don't think, we're not taught to be comfortable in our own bodies. We're not comfortable to be taught with these contexts. And so I think I was always kind of like, everything just felt like, wow. I don't know if I should be here.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I should be here. Like, how does this work? I don't even know how this works. And so, other than discovering masturbation, which is great, like those things, sure. But like to have shared experiences, I think that was not something that it even crossed my mind at the time. There was just so much trauma at home. There was so much instability at home that I think my personality was just very much geared about like, how do I just not make a mess in life? And so I think coming to the idea of my sexual self and my relationship self, very much probably is parallel for a lot of people as they're kind of evolving into that pubescence and through that process. It's clumsy AF, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. What clumsy AF is a nice little catchphrase to think about what youth sexuality can be like, because it really can be very clumsy for sure. When did you discover like sex with men? Like what was the first kind of experience where you? It
was terrible.
Yeah.
It was awful. It was awful. Now it's weird though, in some ways, because it was awful, but it was also very much, in some ways I would spend chunks of my life kind of living through this experience to explore it more. It was a public experience. It was a guy who was driving around in the downtown of where I grew up. There was this adult bookstore in the center, and people it was called The Loop, which is, again, many cities have similar things. I would write my honors thesis on public sex in college. So I would spend years working on essentially researching and talking about the way that public sex spaces are created and structured to sort of create affirmation cycles and other forms for people to find safety, security, and connection, at least on their own terms, within that space. So without going on too long, essentially, like I found somebody who was driving around. I went back to their place. It was horrid. It was the terrible experience. Lots of, but also like lots of intrigue. And there's a certain grisly, dirty grittiness that lives within kind of these, anonymous kind of things that I also have come to love over time. So I was certainly not in the right headspace to be there. I couldn't have set parameters around my own safety if I'd wanted to, because I didn't know how to articulate them. And so there were things that could have gone much worse than they did. But it was also not enjoyable. So I will go with both of those things.
I feel that it's like, you know, sex can be complicated, right? It can be both good and bad. At the same time, you can hold those things in, you know, in your hands and deal with that duality. That seems like it started you on a adventure around public sex, like maybe a lifelong adventure. But like, what is public sex? What did that mean to you? Like, why do you think that's part of your story?
You know, first of all, there weren't a lot of other options. And so, you know, for young queer people, or, you know, there weren't a lot of places to connect if you were under the age of 21. And, you know, you weren't able to access bars, especially at that time. So we're in the late 90s. So between fears around HIV seroconversion or fears around violence, that kind of stuff, there were a lot of limitations as to where you could connect with other people. Mm-hmm. And so public sex spaces were and still are, which is something that I've been really kind of interested in, the current sort of space that they take. So it's a different conversation. But like at the time, right, those were really necessary spaces. So not everybody who engaged in public sex spaces was engaged in public sex, which is also really important. They became themselves community enclaves of safety. So individuals, there were plenty of, at the time, what we would call fag hags, or, you know, cis women who would hang around straight men, or gay men, or at least, you know, closeted men, and kind of hang out. They would also hang out in the spaces. There were some people who were playing with gender identities, who were also playing with, you know, were living in those spaces and may not be engaged sexually, may or may not. But there was this idea of this young and older population that would play this interweaving game. Mm-hmm. And it was a game of affirmation. It was a game of engagement. It was a game of learning. It was a game of mentoring in some contexts. Again, sometimes predatory, sometimes not. But it was fascinating that way. And I think I came to love the sort of subcultural, sociocultural geography of it. And I always fell in love with it. I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with it.
Yeah. That's fabulous. I think you're right that at a certain time and context, like public sex spaces were critical, and they remain critical, but for different reasons today than in the past. And different groups use them in different ways. And that changes over time, obviously. How did you know what to do, I guess, is really what I'm curious with. Because I think that's a question that a lot of us struggle with as young queer people, like in those first sexual experiences with men.
Oh my gosh, it's clumsy is the only word I can think about it, is that we tend to be, you know, we're all everybody's clumsy. I mean, I think wherever you are on the sexual identity spectrum, you invariably, if you come in having the rule book already in hand, one, you're probably doing it wrong. And two, right? Like you also don't leave room for exploration and finding the places that you find pleasure. So to me, I think what I've always been drawn to in intimacy is the connection with the other person. Now, it's not that I don't like anonymous play, or that I don't like play where, you know, you don't have that level of involvement. There's Foucault was very influential for me. And so there's always this sort of fantastical nature of a dark room with just bodies hanging out and like, sure. And there's part of me that loves that. But what I really enjoy is the connection. Like I really find value in the humanity of it. And I think the different body types, the different experiences. And so to me, that always, I think that always was invigorating for me. And so I learned by listening to other people's bodies. Like that was really important to me.
Tell me about listening to other people's bodies, because I think people struggle with that. They want to do everything verbally, you know, with words. And obviously there's a lot that isn't done without words. What does it mean to listen to someone's body to you?
I think sometimes it just means some patience to not to give them contact in a way that isn't always directly to like genitals or other parts of the body in that way. Like sometimes it is the more subtle spaces that lets people relax because the pressure's not in the same point. And you can listen to what brings them pleasure, to feel them relax, to feel them, and also just to be enjoyed. I know it sounds weird to say, but like so much, and there are places for it. Again, there's glory holes. There's plenty of places that you can enjoy and just straight up genitalia play, like not a lot else going on, right? Yeah. Fine, great, enjoy it. There's also toys for that. But I think what I really like about the human interaction is like, I want to be able to connect with you. And sometimes that's just like shoulder, like just touching the shoulder in the right way and seeing how they respond. Like, do they want to be touched? Are they comfortable with that level of touch? It's interesting to me how many people are not. And that part, I think, is something that I learned early on just from public engagement and just kind of what that meant. And then in my own personal life, as I started to integrate it, to me, it became a critical piece to understand like where people are at and how to connect with them, especially when I care about them.
Yeah, and you still like list. It's like that listing, right? It's feeling when someone like kind of pulls away or like resists touch, and that, as you say, can be instructive far more than words because it might not even be something they're conscious of, and that's really adds to the complexity and beauty of sex. Like it's the what makes it kind of magical.
Or they lean into a feeling they've never had. Like there are sometimes, and this again, we could talk about sort of the gender representations here. Women are probably, in my experience, like to be touched a bit differently, and oftentimes, I think I wish cis men, or at least the individuals, the sort of masculine center folks who do touch them, would sometimes take a step back a little bit. And I think I learned by many of the women in my history, and then many of the women in my community, who are very confident in their agency, who are very confident in the ways they like being touched, to acknowledge that like there is something really important about living into that touch. And also that consent piece. And I don't mean consent like an overt, like I need a formal consent, but that consent that like, yes, this feels good, or yes, this feels safe. This feels like you're not going to hurt me, especially particularly in incidences where you are with people you don't know. And it is sort of, or they as men aren't comfortable with their own bodies. And you have to sort of wrestle with that. And again, all people wrestle with that across all genders, but masculine representations of that can sometimes be brutish. They can push back really hard. They're like, no, man, just a dick. And you're like, okay, we know how this is going to go. And like, I'm not sure this is working for me. And I've had situations like that where I've been like, I'm not sure this is going to be. Sometimes it is. Sure. I'm not, whatever. Sometimes I'm into it. But if I'm not into it, like sometimes I'm like, it's just not for me. Like, that's not really like, if it's just transactional, it's okay. Sometimes it's got a place. But generally speaking, I think it's also listening for that pleasure.
I hear you say that you really prize and value this form of kind of deep, intimate connection, and kind of have learned over time that the transactional sex is less appealing. Are there some experiences in your head where you feel like you learned that lesson that were bad, that were instructive though, in terms of learning like what you think you wanted for the future?
It's hard to answer that in sort of an absolute. I think it's sometimes how you enter the space or you enter the engagement, right? Like if I'm going into a back room in a bar in Europe, right? It's my expectations of what the transactional nature of the engagement will be is different. That being said, I have had some great experiences with people that I still have contact with where I expected to just be, like fully transactional and were not. And so I think to me, I'm always open to sort of seeing and reading where the other person is. And if it's so cold and so in some ways very selfish, I'm really not interested in that level of selfishness. I know and again, there's no harm in it. No, not a judgment here. Some people could go in and they want selfishness, and there are some people who are just very eager to serve, and that's great. I have a dominant nature, so I get that. I like a little bit more engagement that way, and so I think I can very early on tell when that friction's there about what I want and what they want. And you just kind of, again, sometimes it's unspoken, and you negotiate and be like, I think it's time for me to step out. Is that kind of answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about young people, and a lot of young people have fear around bad experiences, and that holds them back from having maybe any experiences sometimes. And so I try to give people some practical advice for how to negotiate those bad experiences. I guess, so maybe rephrasing it in those ways, like, do you think there are tips that would work for people trying to negotiate those experiences where they feel like, this is not kind of what I had.
I mean, the number one thing I'm always going to say is, and not everybody feels capable of doing this, right? Like having the confidence to be like, hey, we're good. Like, that's good. That's enough.
Right.
I'm good. Right. Like being able to draw a line and be like, hey, thank you. I'm going to step out and we're good. How you respond to somebody who may not be able to hear that message, that takes a lot more courage. And I think also being cognizant of the space you're in. So again, if you are not comfortable drawing those boundaries, really choosing spaces where you can be heard. So when music's not so loud, when there's space, when somebody can clearly get your signals, if you're trying to do this in a back room with no light or an adult arcade with no light, like, I don't know how you might not be seen. They might not be able to hear you. There's things like that have to be considered. So finding ways to do that, again, like that's a way to stop it from happening. If you're in the middle of one and you don't know what to do, gosh, over the years, I kind of learned how to deal with it. I know that's not the best answer. And I'm not sure that's going to help young people that way. Like, but I was also, I have a history as an escort. I've got a history in doing different, in doing sex work. And so negotiating bad sex is kind of like part of the work. Do I get a tip? But I hear your question, and I think it's a very valid one. I think what I wish there were more spaces for young people to have those conversations about, with their friends, with other people, to say like, whoa, I didn't know what to do here. I was not enjoying this, whether it's physical, like this person does not know how to suck a dick. That is a distinct conversation to have. Or whether this person really made me feel threatened. Like this person really made me feel nervous. This person made me feel like they were going to violate my boundaries.
Yeah.
And how do I do that? And I think that I would love to see more conversation about. I know it's been a big motivation for me within the harm reduction movement to encourage that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think the idea of saying no is so easy. And it's just like the idea of saying yes, I think, is conversely, like we have this idea that we're just going to know what we want and know what we don't want. And it's like easy peasy. We just say no to what we don't want and say, wait, yes. But in practice, when you're faced with a real life human being who has feelings, who might be your boyfriend or, someone you really are attracted to, it's a different ball game altogether. So I'm always kind of in search of like how to like help young people think about those situations, because you have to kind of kiss a lot of frogs to get to the I don't know what the metaphor is, but to get to the good stuff, right? Like there's a lot of not great stuff on the way.
But the mistakes are, the mistakes can be good. Like you said, they, not. I think the hunt for a prince sometimes can overtake the actual moments to enjoy the experience you're having, and to remember that it's not forever, and to take from that like there's different versions and pleasures you may not know that you have as you learn someone else's body and learn someone else's. Again, separate from threat, separate from somebody who's doing you harm. There's all of those things that are healthy boundaries to have. But yeah, I mean, sometimes you're with someone with a different body type or a different sense of pleasure and all of that. And to just give them a chance to listen to that. One, it makes you a better lover. I mean, it really does. It makes you recognize, because the person that you're, the big hottie that you're dating right now is going to be 10 years older at some juncture. And if you don't learn how to like work with them and their bodies as they age, then that will be a point of friction. If you don't learn how to work with your own body as you age, it'll be a point of friction, and not good friction.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Like we can desire what is now, but the future will be different than the now. And we have to kind of anticipate that. I think that's productive, although I doubt that's something many people can hear very well, because, especially young people, right? It's just sort of far in the future, distant. Thinking about that phase of sexual development for you, were you using terms like top and bottom back in the day when you were first starting to have sex with men?
Oh yeah. And I didn't really bottom very much early on. I think part of it was coming out when I did. So I was 17 in 1990. So, again, coming through college through the 90s and college, like that's definitely an apex of a lot of the conversations around HIV and all those things. And so I think positionality was a big part of the conversation. I wasn't, I think I was cognizant but I was certainly sexually active in a way that, to me, stigmatizing people living with HIV then didn't make any sense, especially as I became an educator years after that. But it was already part of my core philosophy, I think, long before that, where I paid attention to the facts. I paid attention to the things, whether, condoms and all the different. I was very rigorous on condom usage, for example, prior to, PrEP usage and things like that. But like this kind of rigor was kind of standard, and positionality was part of it. And I think that eventually would come to be part of the conversation around the toolkit that people have to prevent seroconversion, HIV seroconversion particularly. That was the big thing, was about pushing that positionality. And so I think I was very much a rigorous top for a long time, for a long, long time.
And that was strategic.
It was subconsciously, I'm sure, strategic. I certainly bottomed, and it didn't happen very often, but I'm grateful that when it did, and if it was for example, without condoms when I was really, really young and I was still sort of learning the ropes, I'm glad it was done in rural Iowa. I'm glad it was done with a closed couple. There were things like that I am in retrospect, like, phew. But at the same time, not all my peers had that opportunity. And I was sort of, I would consider myself relatively knowledgeable then. I mean, I was always learning, but compared to many of my peers, and I was certainly not always making the decisions that were in my best benefit down the road. And I think that would inform my harm reduction work later. But I think topping was a very easy way for me to do that. It was a very easy way for me to sort of think of my risk as less.
Yeah. At the time back in the day, this is like a time capsule now. We're talking about pre-PrEP era. It's crazy to think that PrEP has been 12 years now. But we talked about that as strategic positioning, that, people would make decisions based on positionality in relationship to HIV. And so that's helpful to kind of hear what that experience is like. Because I think a lot of, frankly, young people, they don't have that's not a reference point anymore, I think, in a post-PrEP era.
Which is good and bad.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like it's just a sort of fact of the context we're in now. It's not necessarily value laden. It just is.
Or a side. Like we didn't have sides then. So go sides.
I know this term is popping up everywhere. So today, you still would mostly use the word top to describe yourself?
No, I'm very versatile. I love my versatility. No, are you kidding me? But again, I'm not a power bottom. I'm not. So I definitely prefer certainly versatile play. It's a big thing. Even as a dom, like subs to me, I prefer them to be versatile. And so to me, that's part of it. Because again, it comes back to pleasure, comfort. They're one of my favorites. One of the cis women that I just am deeply enamored with. I won't name names, but she's one of the most beautiful people I've ever met. One of the greatest people I've ever had collaboration with. She used to fist her boyfriends. And like part of what I loved about being in community with so many people with such levels of confidence about their bodies, about the ways they live, the way they exist in this world, is that they always came to the conversation with this idea that positionality didn't determine whether, someone's role. And in queer culture, it's often been that case where that has somehow been a diminishing characteristic, or it's been a limiting characteristic. And I think I just appreciate that the models in my life were like, it's your body. You should work with it as you want.
I love that. It's actual mentors, basically, who kind of gave you different ways of thinking about the world, it sounds like. Yeah.
And just different ways of thinking my own body. So when I hear that voice in my head, like, oh, I'm a bottom, like, but it's also about listening to my own body. I am not a power bottom. There are certain times, there are certain ways that I want to enjoy it. If I want to be comfortable, there's certain things I have to know if my body's not up for it. If my body's not here. So we're not into it today. So that's not where we're going to go. Yeah. That takes some listening. And I think it also takes a little bit of practice and being able to be in tune with your body. And I think I hope that young people and all people have an opportunity at all ages to do that. Because I think even I would say more mature population community members, that's a big issue that I feel like I see these days.
I guess I'm thinking of two kind of parallel phenomena, and I'm wondering your take on them. One is the possibility that over time, we become more comfortable with nuance in our own sexuality and are able to practice being like a submissive top, which is, maybe as a young person, not as obvious a choice. Or really, conversely, I think there's been an explosion of vocabulary, as we all know, that now like passive top is a choice on like sniffies, for example. And that just, I mean, what? Like that's a new kind of phrase.
Some of them always were. So that's not.
No, exactly. Right. So is it that the vocabulary is like reshaping us, or are we reshaping? Like, what do you think the like causal relationship is there between us and these concepts?
Oh, I think the vocabulary is just reflecting the realities that were always there. Like one of my favorite terms that's evolved is homoflexible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So homoflexible to me is one of the most fascinating terms and marks a significant change in the way that gay people were so threatened by an attraction to opposite sex engagement or sort of a broader gender relationship in their sexual engagement, because they were like, oh, traitor, right? Like I said, my first publication was in a bisexual publication. So I was a traitor to everybody. Right. And so this idea that one could primarily engage in, homosexual and homoerotic behavior, but recognize that like I could be attracted to, or I could be turned on, or I could find pleasure from a different experience. Love it. So to me, the changes in language actually are more, they're more representative. And what I love is they give us a much freer sense about thinking about how we can evolve, not just where we are today, but where we're going and where we've been. And I think it's important to note that there's a temporal aspect to that too. So where you are today is not where you're going to be in 10 years. And that you're able to sort of shape your body. Maybe today you're pansexual. You might down the road feel like you're not, that you are more directed or more interested in a particular gender identity than another. And so that's great. I love it. I love being able to honor it and name it and put it in the room and be like, yeah, like that's my story. So to me, love it. Love it.
Love the new vocab. I mean, I mostly agree, right? Like there's a part of me that's like an kind of an old crotchety man who's like, you need a term for everything. But on the other hand, especially with my students, I really see they find many of these new terms like really valuable to like kind of validate their own experience that they were already having, really. Like it's not like it, so I hear you. It's something I think about a lot. Like, right. Like, are these terms, some people would argue, right, that these terms hinder us, that they limit the possibilities. And sometimes I find that appealing, and I don't know.
I mean, the binary is very comfortable because if it's not this, then it's that. If it's not this, then it's that. But how many people live within the far extremes of that? I mean, whether you're talking about the Kinsey scale, and that's antiquated, right? Or whether or not, whatever you want to talk, even no matter where you want to talk about anything, there's no real black and white. Most of us live in this middle of the gray. And I think what I love about the expansion of language is that, yes, is it both prohibitive? And is it also liberatory? Absolutely. And as a queer person, live into that, because that's what queer is about. It is about the living dichotomies and holding the multiple things at the same hands, like testicles, I guess, holding them in the same hand and being okay with it and recognizing the human experience is this very complex journey. And it is this space where people are going to sometimes not even be aware of what their desires are. It assumes that everyone knows themselves so well. And I think I come from a school of Foucauldian analytics where I'm like, I don't think you know yourself at all. I think you are working through a story and you're hearing it as it happens, but honestly, you're mostly playing back its history, and its predictability is very impossible. It's very difficult for you to get to. You think you know what you're going to do until you're there, and then you don't. And then you're like, whoa, what was that about? And you're like, ha, surprise. That's how life happens. And I think what I love about this new language, about this vocabulary, is that it creates an imagination of what's possible when I think about my own story and the decisions I want to make. And I think that is what I fought for, that every person be seen in the language and the story that they wish to tell. And I think that, to me, is a beautiful thing.
Is there an experience? Yeah, I saw you smile there. I'm just thinking, is there an experience you're thinking of there where you're like, you thought you knew what you're going to do, but then surprise?
I mean, there are many, right? Like there's sometimes where I feel like I'm going to be really bold and I'm going to go into this fisting experience and I'm going to do great. And I remember this one time, I was having this interaction and this guy was like really going to go. And then he pulls out a glove. And I was like, I don't know that I can do this. I'm really nervous now because I was like, oh, fisting, like fist done. And I was like, but then I realized fist body, complicated. And then how long it took. Like that was the other, I think I'm just grossly impatient. So also, unless they are really practiced, fisting bottom, takes a long time and a lot of poppers. And I can't, it's a lot of poppers.
Right.
So, yeah. And I wasn't really prepared for that. And I was like, oh, I can do it. But like now my expectations are very different.
So I have sober friends. Do poppers, it's like, is sobriety and fisting like incompatible? Like, is there a way to do it without poppers? I don't know because I'm not part of that community. So.
It's a great question. I am also not in that community. So I learn and talk to other people. It's certainly been integral for people to relax enough and kind of get the sphincter kind of like to a place where they're comfortable. I imagine like I would love to try, but I've never been able to get that comfortable. Like I said, I have a negotiated relationship as a bottom, and I do enjoy it. But like there are people who look aspirationally at that more than I do. And I think if I were comfortable enough, I would like to try. I don't know that I've never done poppers. Again, I've been sober my whole life. And so not that poppers necessarily exclude that. I think again, there's this sort of wave of stuff that sit in that. I think I was associated with VHS. And so my head always just goes to a rental store every time I smell it. So I don't know what the answer to that is. All I know is I'm always willing to try stuff. But I would want to try to do as naturally as possible. And I don't know that it could get relaxed enough for that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that. It takes a deep state of relaxation for sure, from what I understand, to get to that point. And poppers do. Since you mentioned it, I was just kind of curious because it seems to be those things are always related. But I'm curious. I ask this question sometimes because I think it helps us to get to some of the intricacies of how we get what we want and how we treat other people and how we build a sexual community. After you have a bad encounter with someone, and let's say not a client, right? There's someone outside of that sex work experience. Are you willing to go back and try again?
Oh gosh, it depends again on the setup, right? Like sometimes it's bad because you're not in the right headspace. Sometimes it's bad because they're not listening yet. It depends on any other connection I have. Now, again, if it's a random encounter, no, probably not. Probably not. Or my expectations change. Like, oh, this is definitely going to be like a hand job circuit because that's because that's a place I can still have my control. I don't need to depend on them. It's fine. I can rub their furry chest or whatever, and this is fine. Happy day. So I can draw those boundaries about physical proximity, right? So if it's like an anonymous account or public account or something like that, if it's somebody that I'm close to, that's harder to talk about because it depends on where they're at and what they're looking for from it and what my regular engagements look like. So if it's somebody that I'm going to interact with often, I'm usually pretty cautious about having any sexual encounters anyways, unless it's somebody that I know I'm going to have that negotiation with on a regular basis. But I would say, yes, sometimes if the connection is there and the emotional and intellectual connection is there, because I'm probably a sapiosexual at heart, like I'm definitely drawn to the intellect. But I think I would restructure the boundaries and restructure kind of what the engagement looks like. So if they're not particularly good in a particular way, or there's just something that's kind of a mismatch somehow, sometimes it's just, cuddling and petting is fine too. There's lots of different ways to show intimacy, that beyond.
Can you think of a time you've changed course like that? I mean, we sort of addressed that, I guess. I'm just curious, like you thought one thing was going to be on the menu and then petting or whatever, or something totally different. And that became like, that was fine. Like that was good.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of an experience in the past, I would say there are people who the bravado can sometimes be more than the outcome. And I think that's more of a statement about queer culture's sentiment that one's value is their sexual vitality.
Right.
And so they go into it as if they have to prove something. And it's like not great because it's not really where they are. And in some ways, you're just dealing with this sort of false expectation out of it. And so once you can sort of change that expectation, then you can go back and be like, well, this is who you are and where you're at.
Yeah.
And I like that. And I could be willing to go back into that scenario with that mindset. And you don't have to perform in a way that isn't natural for you. And I found in the past when I've done that, somebody I played with years ago who very much kind of came into it like, oh, I've got to be, all like, oh, I'm going to eat your ass and blah, 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 blah. Do these things. I'm like, yeah, good. And then you'd get there and it'd be like, and I was like, oh my God, stop it. And it's okay. Like, because that's not, we set up this thing where one's value is their vitality. And I think about this as I age. I don't want to go on too long about it, but like essentially I think about those things as I age as a factor.
Yeah, definitely. The bravado is real out there, and I'm guilty of it. I think we're all guilty of it too, right? Like, because you get caught up in the scripts, and the scripts are so like can be wild. I mean,
do you change your voice? Do you change your voice? Do you get like a bravado, like, oh, I'd like you to do me good, or I'd like to do you good? Like, do you get that? Look at you blushing. Look, you got it right there. Do you do that? Do you do that? Like, oh man, please do it so I can make this my ringtone, so I can get like a good ringtone.
My husband would have more to say about that than I would, I'm sure. But yeah, I think whether or not we're conscious of it or not, like we are always sort of performing in all aspects of life, and sex is of course one of those where it can become dramaturgical. I feel like I'm up for an Emmy sometimes or something, like.
Well, it's funny though. In talking about this, like there's a scenario that I really enjoyed. I was traveling and I was at this bar, hanging out and that kind of stuff. And this person comes up, adorable, beautiful, beautiful person. And I wasn't really particularly planning to hook up. Like that wasn't really the intention in the night. I mean, who doesn't love some good flattery? So we'll go for that. Like who doesn't love some good flattery, some good affirmation? I'm a Leo. I'm going to eat all day, right? So, but what was interesting is that it was not only flirtatious, but we did connect it. And then when it came time for, I don't know what you want to call it, the closing of the deal, right? Like it was very tactical flirtation, adorable. Again, beautiful smile, just gorgeous. And tactical thing. And then we're like, so do we go anywhere? And he looks at me and he's like, but I just want to cuddle. And I was like, yeah. I'm like, I totally would have him. I would have totally let him. He was beautiful, and not just beautiful in physical appearance, which he also was, but just in smile and energy and all of that at the same time. But it's also like, I just want to hang out. Like, I like this. I like this level of intimacy, and I think I really value that. And so over the years, I've been very lucky to have different experiences with that sort of scenario, right? Like different things like that. But it was notable that it was almost like he was expecting me to be off-put by it, because I think he was expecting like there's this, this thing that like, oh, now I've got to perform. Now we've got this flirtation. There's definitely some sexual energy here. And now what I'm going to do is now I'm going to throw water on it. But that's not really what he did. What he did was say, this is what I'd like to do. And I'd like to do that with you. And that invitation is beautiful. It's beautiful. And it endeared him to me forever.
Yeah.
And taught me a lot.
And it's also just like in knowing what you want and asking for it is also very sexy. It just in and of itself, right? Like whether or not, you're necessarily responsive to it, you can appreciate just like it's hot, right? To be so sure in that way of what you want. I have a friend, there's a non sequitur, but his profile headline is like cuddle therapy, because that's his thing. And he gets so much action based on that, because I think we're all craving intimacy, like whether or not we want to admit it or not. And especially as men, we're not really told we should admit that.
We don't learn how to do it. Like we don't learn intimacy. And I think if I've employed something as a lover, I love saying that term. It just makes me giggle every time I say it. But I as a lover, in intimacy, it is, we talked earlier about listening to, and that really in some ways is what that is. It is that confidence to know that like the pleasure can come from so many parts of the body. It can come from so many places. And again, speaking as a sapiosexual or somebody who very much prioritizes intellect, certainly I know that that's a big turn on for me. Like you want to quote some what Edna St. Vincent Millay? Fine, great. Well, let's go have sex now. We'll do it. So awesome. Great. Good job. So whatever, bring it. So I think that there is though this thing about in being a good lover, whether you're in a monogamous relationship, a poly, whether it's open, whatever the case is, people want to be seen and they want to be heard. And I think anybody who is a good lover, and of the people I've learned from, whom I've either had sex with or engaged intimately with or not, models that I have never had any intimacy with in that context, but have simply brought that, not confidence in their lives and who they are. They still wrestle with all the self-esteem issues, but confidence in knowing, listening to their own body and being like, this is where I am, and I'm interested in where other bodies are, and I'm considerate of those other bodies. And that, sexy.
Looking back on, and I know this is like a difficult question, obviously, and there's no right answer or probably no singular answer, but if you're looking back on all the sex you've had, is there an experience that jumps out as like, this was the best?
All I can answer to that is, I've lived in 17 cities and people say, which city is the best? Every city brought its own memories. Every city brought its own experiences. What I'm grateful for is a story that's just rich in all these different chapters and these pieces. There isn't one that's just the best, because honestly, again, it depends on the person that I was with and the engagement I have. So I don't know. I know it seems maybe flippant or trite to say like they're all unique. There's definitely, moments that stand out, intimate moments that stand out, pieces of unexpected spaces. Like I remember having sex in an alley behind a church on the coast of a foreign nation, like in the moonlit night, like, and just jerking off with this guy and then like rubbing it on the church wall like that. Sure. Right. Like there's plenty of things that live within the sort of, panoply of experiences that are there. Right. But I don't know if that's, can I use that word that way? I'm going to use that word that way.
Do it. Here. Yeah.
But, I think what I'm grateful for is the people that I've been able to build relationships with, whether they were short or long term. And I don't mean relationships like, romantic relationships, but relationships with people that I've come to trust, people I've been in contact with for 30 plus years, that I've had intimate engagements with, where we both see each other as humans, where we all see each other as connected. And I treasure that. Like it's a dynamic of a relationship that also has other layers and other pieces to it. And to me, I'm grateful it's there. And if I never have another intimate experience with that person or those people again, then that's fine. That's the shared story that we have. Sometimes we do, like 20 years later or whatever it is. And it's also interesting because we're also different bodies and different people. So I wouldn't say there's a one. You're all beautiful. All of you, if you're watching this and I've had sex with you, you're beautiful.
I hear that, of course. I wonder, though, maybe not in specific experiences, but what do you think the qualities are where you look back and you think like, yeah, that was amazing? Like,
how am I supposed to choose that? I mean, getting in the back room sometimes was amazing, and I don't have their name. Like getting at the same time, like a weekend spent with somebody I had no idea I would expend with on like a vacation ship or whatever it is, also amazing. My partner of 11 years, amazing. And I love very much and enjoy the sex that we have, right? So like they're just all so unique in their own way because the people that I'm engaged with are unique in their own way. Gosh, it sounds so trite, like a Hallmark. Like I feel like it's got to be some Hallmark card somewhere around that. But like you're special, just like you was too. Maybe, I don't know. But so there isn't. I guess that's what I love. I think what I've come to learn without getting, I'm sure I've been long-winded. So thank you for your patience on all my long-windedness. I think what I've come to think about as I turn 50 this year right now, right? And also being around sexual and reproductive health, rights and social justice for so many years is I'm grateful that I never lost sight of the humanity of the people that I was engaged with and celebrate like the different body types and life experiences and all these things that I was able to connect with in ways that were pleasurable, enjoyable, intimate, fun. Oh my gosh, joy joy has to be part of it too in its own right. Like there's all of those things that for those of us who grew up in the HIV, in the middle of that crisis, were just torn from us. And I think the idea to reclaim that and have that as part of our bodies, as part of our experiences, that has been a gift. Because that was not the story that many people experienced. It was not the story that many people had an opportunity to access during that particular wave. And I will even say today, in an era, and again, where we're still seeing so much stigma about sexual behavior around our own bodily autonomy, our freedom for everybody that is just being challenged at every angle. So the joy of it, and oh my gosh, it is fulfilling and replenishing to have that.
What does joy look like in sex?
Oh, it is that. It's that look, and it's the look in the eyes when they come. Oh my God, it's so happy. It's such a happy thing. Such a happy thing. But it's also that moment where they're like, they just want to touch and like touch in a way that you want to be touched, and they can see that from you, and they're reading it back, and you also are getting it. So to me, that's a lot of joy, and that sometimes comes with laughter, and it sometimes comes with that grin. Oh my gosh, that joy, that sort of, and that intense moment, like, again, even in my home life, it really matters a lot to me that there are these moments that just feel very intimate and very, very there and very present. And I just love like when the pup looks at me in the eye and like, I know, like those are things that, I just think are beautiful.
Yeah. Break that. How do you find it?
Find it? Oh, that's a toughie. You mean like when people are husband hunting, or you mean like in the world?
I mean, literally, like, you're going to go out there and you're thinking, I'm looking to have this like sex that has these qualities that you think are really great, like joyful sex. Like, because I hear, like I hear from a lot of young people that like, this is not the kind of sex that they're finding in the world. And they're frustrated by that. So I guess what strategies have you found for finding that connection?
Be interested in other people. Mm-hmm. I know it sounds counterintuitive, it sounds strange that we have to say it sometimes, but be interested in other people. I think for me, and again, I can only speak for me, that's what draws me in. Like there are people I've had sex with who I would not consider, they're not the in fact, what's interesting is it's interesting. I find interesting sometimes is for years, right? Like I worked with sex workers for like 20 years as an activist and still continue to support decriminalization efforts and things like that. But like I was around porn stars and I was around escorts and strippers and all these people whose job it was to look beautiful. And that's great. And many of them I have deep admiration and appreciation for and affection for. I think there's great relationships there. But I think so many people, including them, oftentimes approached their engagements with other people with a lack of curiosity and a lack of wanting to engage with other people. They were looking for affirmation, which is like, I want to be interesting to you. Like that's my goal here. My goal is that I am interesting to you. Uh-huh. And I think we're missing a piece where we are interested in the other people, that whether you want to call that active listening, whether you want to call that whatever. But if you're not interested in them, don't them. Like, don't. It won't be enjoyable, probably. It won't be particularly great. They won't listen to you, probably. So that's probably, you're not going to get a lot of mutuality out of that. And so don't do it. But approach the world to hang out with people who you do find interesting, who you do find curious, who you do want to spend time with. And you'll find that like once whether you're naked or with your clothes on, like at that point, if you're able to sort of expose a little bit of that vulnerability with boundaries, all the controls, all the things that are there, but you can still do that, you'll find that it's a much more enjoyable experience, even if it's just stroking out or petting or like, I don't know, whatever, like, except for that thing, there's this toy that you can stick your dick in called a something box, which is a very weird toy. And I don't even know how that thing works. I've been looking at it for years, but don't do that. I don't know what that thing is, but it's weird because they both send it. It's the weirdest ads I've ever seen in my life. So other than that, give yourself some space to be curious, you know?
Do you think you can do that on the app?
I think you can. I think you can approach them that way on the apps. Like, I think, people have a portrait of what they think perfection looks like. And again, everybody's attracted to different stuff. I get that. But it's worth asking yourself, like, of the things you find most attractive, do they also come with the characteristics that also make them fundamentally unattractive? Can the things coexist at the same time? If somebody's going to work 20 hours at the gym to look pretty into their job, and you are wondering why it is that they're maybe not as curious about you, that might be part of it. I'm not saying that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. There are people I know who are in great fitness and do a lot of different stuff, and they are very curious people. But the culture of that, the culture of body image, doesn't necessarily yield itself to a space where there's a lot of interest in other people. Just like there are people who are not physically fit and maybe interested in their life and that they're focused on their problems and their only stuff, and they're not interested in curiosity to you or that kind of stuff. You should be able to listen for that. And so you can do that in apps. I've met great people through apps, great friends, great non-sexual friends, great, friends across the gamut. And that's usually because I'm also interested in being a human being all the way through. Like my dick, my ass, like all those things, fine, great. I love my fur. Great. But I hope that you want to spend time with me for a few reasons. If you want to spend time.
Yeah, I hear that. I definitely think you can be curious, and there is a way to approach guys online where you seem like an interesting person. I don't know. It's such a stupid baseline level. Like it's not even that high of a bar. And yet, man, so many of the messages you get and sometimes send, I have to say I'm guilty of it as we all are not that interesting. And
great pics.
Yeah, right.
Great pics.
And I get the, I don't know.
But the risk starts with you, right? The risk starts like, when I have a profile and that kind of stuff, like my profiles have, some of the basics in there, but they also don't. They also are like, I refer to myself as an activist all the time. I will put stuff in there about current initiatives that I'm working on. And I actually like people with that profile sometimes that have probably whether there's no mutual attraction or not, or that kind of stuff. But sometimes I'll just send it out and be like, that is a great profile. I love that you're sharing a little bit of yourself and your story here, because that tells me that you want to engage with the world in a holistic way, in a whole way, I guess in a whole way too. That's kind of funny in itself, in a holistic way. But that there are things about which you want to express a curiosity in your life. And I think I enjoy that, even if they don't overlap with mine. I really respect that people are willing to put that part of themselves, that part of their story out there.
Yeah, I try to get. I hear that. I try to give positive people. People have told me maybe I have a praise fetish. I think it's just I'm just a nice person sometimes. Like I'm like I don't know that we need a word for that. That's my old man.
You Midwesterners. I relate.
I would send those messages and be like, really great profile, because I want to create that environment. And many times people don't respond, and that's totally fine. But I just want to like put that positive energy out in the world, no matter what guys do with it. I think it's valuable.
I mean, it says a lot about also the sex that maybe you and I both have, right? Like it says that we are interested in people. And I think fundamentally, certainly sex is about pleasure. There's a certain space for anonymity and anonymous play and that kind of stuff. I get it. But like the brain is also a sexual organ. And because I've lived my life sober, so half the point of inebriation is to dull a lot of that experience. I live eyes wide open. So I want my experiences to be meaningful. I want them to be engaged. I want to be engaged with them because it's awesome. Otherwise, I do something else. So I think it says a lot about you when you're responding to people online that way. I think for people who are struggling with that and having the courage to be able to do that, I think it is finding different points in your personality that you feel like you want to share, that you feel comfortable sharing, and making it an invitation for people to come hang out with me. I'm cool.
Just leave a wall. And I think a lot of people build walls with their profiles, know this, that, or this. And then like, well, tell me what you do like, what are you, rather than frame it in negative. Anyways, that's another big mantra of mine. Like, make it positive, make it positive. Like, why is it so negative? Anyway, I like to end every interview with a segment I call Sordid Lives and Untold Tales, or SLUT for short.
Okay.
What's the sluttiest thing you've ever done?
Gosh.
Go through the Rolodex.
Here's the thing. I have epically failed. You know what? I'm going to take a different tack on this. I have epically failed trying to do the sluttiest things I've ever done. I have had a room at the Parliament House and I have left the door open and no one came in.
That would be me.
I have tried to throw sex parties.
No,
and I couldn't get nothing. And I don't know if I like didn't put it on right or like I don't know. I maybe I'm just not everybody's cup of tea. I don't know. But like I have tried some pretty sordid stuff over the years that have epically failed. And I'm always amazed at like these people will be like, I've got 18 people for my gangbang. Now I don't know that I want to do that, but I'm always kind of like, kudos. You know, you like gotta, you know what you want, and you're able to do that. I clearly, I need to bake more cakes or have more hors d'oeuvres. I'm not sure what it is, but I would say my biggest problem is they epically fail.
Yeah,
is that my desire is sometimes greater than the outcome, and then like sometimes though, on the flip side of that, I won't be looking for it at all, and I am in a back room with 6 people. And like life. And so I've at least chalked it up to maybe just not my time.
Well, I appreciate that. I just like to ask that because, you know, I think we all have these, if some people call them war stories or whatever, but like just moments that stand out, or and in your case, the absence of those moments. But I think that speaks to something too, just about the complexity and reality. I just want, you know, the real experiences to come through because we're trained not to talk about it in public. And I think that's a shame.
No, absolutely. I mean, expressing desire is courage because this isn't the culture that allows it. And queer desire particularly, you know, is always inherently political. Hence the story of my entire harm reduction existence. And so I appreciate you and bringing these stories forward, and all the work that you do, Trevor, is phenomenal. And again, I think something to be honored and appreciated. So I wanted to take a minute and also thank you.
Thank you, Shane. And for people curious about the work that you do, where can they find more about you and find out more information?
You know, you know, I mean, we haven't really talked about my company at all. So, you can find out about me. You can go to shanelukas.com. It'll point you to my company. We're a brand communications company. But I also am certainly an advocate in many communities and speak out around social justice and equity in a context of queer liberation, anti-racism, a variety of contexts. So always happy to do that. And I make new friends. I'm always happy to make new friends and encourage that. And if there's any opportunities to, again, be in community with people to talk about destigmatization, whether that's around sex work, whether that's around queer liberation, whether it's around queer, always happy to join those conversations.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Shane.
Absolutely. Pleasure. Thank you, Trevor.
That's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening, as always. And remember, if you're not having your best sex, I am here to help. My services as a sex coach can help you identify and overcome those barriers that are sitting between you and your best sex life. Find out more on my website, thebestgaysex.net. Till next time.